Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I am aware that I'm standing between you and your supper, your dinner. So you'll bear with me. Thank you, sir. I value your presence here. I've just come from Greece, where I was talking to the American and Hellenic Chamber of Commerce. In fact, when Kate invited me, I had just received an invitation from the American and Hellenic Chamber of Commerce to go and give them a keynote on very similar issues around sustainability. And I wondered why they decided that I should be the person talking to them. It turns out that one of them had watched an episode that had done with the BBC talking on Ubuntu and ways in which we can link this African concept to issues of environmental healing and environmental sustainability. And so they decided to invite me there. I just arrived from there yesterday. And Kate, thank you really for inviting me here. I've been to Germany several times, but I've never been to Cologne. So it's really exciting to be here. Around the time, you remember when you invited me, I was traveling to Tübingen to give a similar talk, and I kept asking myself, why am I doing this to myself? You know, keep moving up and down to give some of the keynotes. The dangers of giving keynotes is that you don't have time to read, and sometimes I just feel like sitting back and listening to some of the wonderful and insightful, presentations that we've had this evening. Nevertheless, I'm here, and there's no escape. So I hope you'll bear with me. Now, I want to start this by showing you a very short, that's the only picture you are going to see on the screen. I'm old-fashioned, so I don't use some of these things a lot. The man you see there is a traditional healer. We call him Dr. Mabena. Dr. Mabena comes from what in South African, I discovered that there's one South African here. Yeah, thank you. Yeah. So, in South Africa, we are not ashamed of having healers. We are not. In fact, the University of KwaZulu-Natal has a section that works with traditional healers alongside, their medical departments. China and India are ahead of us in some of these things. So that man is a healer. He's called Dr. Mabena. Dr. Mabena tells us that he had a dream. He's a former Mkhonto wa Sizwe. This was the military wing of the ANC. And he came back home, he didn't have much to do. So he got this dream from his father, who was telling him to develop an area in his neighborhood, what we call townships. Townships are where the indigenous people of South Africa, the blacks generally, were confined to, okay? And he kept getting this dream from his father, telling him, go and develop that area. Go to the mountain. And he didn't know, what do I do with a mountain? The father kept coming to him in a dream. Dreams are very common, Even those of you who read the Bible, you know that, that God always revealed himself through dreams, okay? So he gets this, and the area around his mountain, this mountain had become a dumping place. People would just go and dump things there. So Dr. Mabena transformed this thing into a botanical garden. Brought in new indigenous species of plants in that area. And in fact, at the moment, at the University of Pretoria, the Department of Plants, are working with him in order for them to learn some of the ideas, the indigenous ideas on plants and how to care for nature from the point of view of tradition. He sees an idea of complementarity that I'm going to talk about, a kind of dialogue between indigenous forms of knowledge and modern, the so-called modern forms of knowledge. Just the next
video?
Yeah, the next video, yeah, okay.
No.
Yeah.
What is done in the whole 60, 70 years? I must be able to get, I've got the community, I've delivered to the community, and I've delivered the what they got. And this case, yes, if God can say, bring the fruit, fortunately that picture my wife is taking and giving to God in place. So, thank you, take a round, because time is against us, take a round and cleanse your eye. This is the most of these plants here are germinated after seed. Some of the plants are beautiful plants. Why is he kind of one? Gary from University of Pretoria also. From which department, Gary?
Plant sciences.
Plant sciences.
Yeah. So he's working very closely with Gary in plant sciences. But the point that I wanted to make before I move to my speech is that on the 5th of October, he came to talk to us at our center. And as he was talking, he told us about the kind of affinity that he has with the plants that is growing there, with the plants that have, decided to come back to that area. And he told us one thing, that I keep talking to those plants. I talk to them. Every time I go there, I say, good morning. Good morning, rabbit. Good morning, this and that. How many of us engage with the plants, with the animals, with the creatures around us? Do we talk to them? Because they do listen. And that is the one lesson that I got from Dr. Mabena that I wanted to share with you this morning. That when you go to your garden to prune those roses, take time to thank the plant. Thank you for giving me these roses. As humanity, we have a tendency of just taking what we call extraction. You just extract, but you don't give back. You don't maintain. And that, for me, reciprocity is at the heart of sustainability that we are talking about today. That's the point I wanted to make with reference to Dr. Mabena. Now, my topic is Banished Knowledges, Ecophilosophy and Decolonial Ecologies in Africa. Let me just outline a few things that hopefully you need to get from my talk before I start reading, because if you don't get anything from my ramblings, at least remember those points. The first thing is that this paper sets out to reaffirm the place of banished knowledges, what we call repressed sites of knowledge, and to suggest that the environmental challenges facing the world today require new epistemological perspective. Remember that. I also argue that there's a deficit in scholarship that needs new ways of thinking. And I suggest that we need to start looking at indigenous forms of knowledge, not simply for offering alternative epistemologies, but also as a method. I want to emphasize, as a method, we need to start looking at indigenous knowledge sites as a method, not just as epistemological perspective, but we see them as a method, as a structure of voyaging through the difficult times humanity and the planetary universe that we talked about finds itself in. As I told the American and Hellenic Chamber of Commerce this week, our challenges as humanity reside in our footprints, and so are the answers to those challenges. I was watching keenly when I saw some footprints here, that if you want to understand the problems plaguing the world today, you got to look back at our footprints. The Ghanaians have an interesting story of this young daughter looking at the father, and the father is peering steadily into the past, looking into the past. And the young girl stops and says, "Father, you are always looking into the past. Why?" And the father says, "My daughter, the answers for our problems reside in the past. The answers for our problems reside in our footprints, in our footsteps, the damage we have done, but also the possibilities of remedying those damages that we have done to the world." So I'm saying in this paper, I'm going to argue, we cannot talk about decoloniality without taking recourse to indigeneity. We cannot talk about decoloniality without taking recourse to indigeneity. And indigeneity, I was talking with my sister here from Australia, and he tells me that some of our African sisters and brothers tell her that they are not indigenous. I wonder why, you know. My point of departure is any colonized people have been part of the empire are indigenous. And they are indigenous precisely because their forms of knowledges were repressed, sometimes violently, as Kate was talking about. So I will argue that there's African philosophical concepts such as Kama, Ubuntu, or Utu in East Africa, and Mat, and those other indigenous communities, as I've learned over the years across the globe, have insisted on the independence and basic relations of mutuality between the human and non-human. So I will use the example of Ubuntu, the concept of Ubuntu, because the starting point of the concept of Ubuntu is the principle of co-agency, to illustrate that dialogic relationship between the human and the non-human. And the idea of personhood that Ubuntu philosophy encapsulates. And I will argue that it is more than simply being about person-to-person relationship. I suggest that in many ways it is also an eco-philosophy because it is undergirded by basic principles of deep ecology and eco-empathy. It is undergirded by a fundamental principle of eco-empathy, which the world needs. So in a fundamental sense, Ubuntu's idea of co-agency signals a pre-metaphysical post-humanist ecological thinking, which decenses the human, which opens its inquiry to non-human life. I see the post-humanist turn as a more engaged mode of the symbiotic and co-evolutionary relationship between the organic and inorganic forms of life, suggesting the need for sustainability and acting responsibly. So co-agency that Ubuntu entails implies living together for the mutual benefit of all and the formation of our interconnectedness, or the interconnectedness between life and all living things. If time allows me, I will also draw attention to how African letters and cultural expression has drawn attention to mutual co-agency between human and the non-human. So if you don't get anything from what I read here, just remember that's all I'm struggling to say through my ramblings. Let me start. The French philosopher and environmentalist Michel Serres, whom I believe some of you may know, has warned that global climate change calls for new epistemologies that no longer imagine themselves as separate specializations, because we need what he calls, and I quote, a collective ethics in the face of world fragility. That is Michel Serres. Now, Serres calls for a kind of restoration of banished knowledges as a response to this challenge, and one that understands the importance of the local while acting in response to the important ecological demands of the global. Kevin Gary Brains and the Cameroonian Achille Bembe, among others, have also argued that African indigenous eco-philosophical positions have not been adequately considered in terms of contributing to the global dialogue on ways to address current climate crisis. In this lecture, I want to pose a challenge by suggesting that key to any decolonial practice, or ecology in our case, must begin to employ indigenous epistemologies that seek to reimagine alternatives to colonial thinking and practice. Presently, our visions of what needs to be done are trapped in dominant conceptions, rationalities, and knowledge-making practices that are deeply embedded in narratives of progress and modernization, which are largely housed in discourses of colonialism. Our challenge during this anthropogenic age is to surface those alternative ways of thinking that have been deliberately, I repeat, deliberately excluded throughout history, and often through violence. Of significance are those localized, ecologically friendly forms of knowledge that have been delegitimized in favor of logics of extraction and exploitation, often masked under universalism and development. And there are many scholars that have written on some of this. The challenge going forward is to acknowledge the deficit in scholarship, as a number of scholars have argued, that there's a deficit in scholarship when it comes to engaging with issues of climate change. Now, to account for this deficit, we need a decolonial episteme and method that allows for the coexistence and conversation between multiple epistemologies or multiple epistemes. But more importantly, to amplify critique and thinking on different scales, from local communities, from the indigenous peoples, and non-European and non-state intellectual traditions. We cannot decolonize our hegemonic ways of thinking and practice simply through dominant knowledge systems that have held sway for centuries, while other knowledges are simply banished, repressed, or denigrated. In the context of African environments and societies, we now know that the impact of colonial interventions and legacies was underpinned by European denigration and displacement of local knowledges developed over centuries in conjunction with local ecosystems, some of which was shared here on the languages of those, native Australians, that we are witnessing today. I don't know how many of you know Craig Mittman. Craig Mittman has written a recent book, and he calls it The Empire of Rubber, Firestone's Scramble for Land and Power in Liberia. And he demonstrates that rubber plantation in Liberia by the USA tire companies devastated the environment by displacing valuable forest biodiversity, causing several soil erosion and spread of diseases. You will be surprised that Ebola that ravaged the world was very much an offshoot of that devastation. This lady here, Veronique Tajo, from Ivory Coast, in the company of men, I will make reference to it later, has written compellingly this powerful narrative by drawing attention to how Ebola came about. I wonder whether we have reflected about the emergence of Ebola and how many of us connect it to the history of the empire. Similarly, the same could be said of widespread large-scale plantations of pine and eucalyptus introduced by colonial power throughout Africa. And yet we continue to have blanket silence on these narratives of extraction and exploitation of African biodiversity. Kate Rigby, our host, in her authoritative book, Reclaiming Romanticism and Towards Ecopoetics of Decolonization, while commenting on the potential for a decolonizing praxis in relation to romantic poetry, reminds us that, and I quote, "For that potential to be realized, however, it is also necessary to put pressure on the culturally specific and historically contingent assumption about human relations with nature," quote unquote, that were exported to the colonies, including through the medium of what? Romantic verse. Romantic ecopoetics. In other words, these two, as she says, must be decolonized. And she adds, and I think this is very important, she says, this in turn requires more inclusive conversations, a deepened dialogue between indigenous and non-indigenous writers in order to discern alternative modes of perceiving, articulating, and embodying our relationships with one another and others, and with our ecologically imperiled earthly environs. End of quote. Now, the fundamental question then is, how do we enact new alternatives to colonial thinking and enduring modes of meaning-making that are self-serving and mask its insidious intentions? The Native American poet, in response to what the questioner posed, Natalia Dyers. I don't know how many of you have listened to Natalia Dyers, an incredible poet, an incredible woman. You must just Google her and listen to some of what she has recorded. The Native American poet, Natalia Dyers, has reminded us that there can be no radical humanities and humanity. No radical humanities and humanity without indigenous knowledge, describing indigeneity as a practice of that place we are in, the space we occupy, even under colonial occupation that is always complementary to itself. She adds that we can only talk meaningfully about climate change and environmental ecology from a location of indigeneity. The point is that that indigenous epistemes offer a different way of reading our worlds and the constitutive social, cultural, political, and spiritual relations. Indigenous knowledge systems stress relationality, connections, reciprocity, conviviality, sharing, social responsibility, and generosity as key or essential elements which underpin the complex process of coming to know. You need some of those essential elements if you are going to engage in a complex process of coming to know. As I was listening to some of the that we had during my visit to Greece, and there's one panel that constantly insisted that we are being alarmist and we are trying too hard. You know, things are not that bad, you know. And in all this, all he was interested was in carbon footprints. You know, the statistics are showing us that carbon footprints are going down. Where? You know. And is environmental degradation just about carbon footprints? Mm-hmm. What about extraction? What's about the damage that has been done to environments? Kate was talking about the extraction of fish, where fishermen are complaining. Ordinary indigenous fishermen complaining because huge, you know, trolleys are coming to extract from the sea itself. What about oil spills? Like the Chinese one that rocked in Mauritius, which was regarded as a pristine place on the continent. What about that? I took a holiday to Mauritius the other day with my wife, and I was horrified. And I was asking myself as an environmentalist activist, what am I doing here? This used to be a wonderful island, the type that you are talking about. The only source, you know, the typical monocrops that are introduced by the colonial governments was only sugar. But at least it still left the island pristine. Now, everywhere you go, everything is being mowed down and new buildings are coming up. And the buildings are only sold in dollars and euros. In dollars and euros. Talking to a local driver who was driving me around, the only source of employment is tourism. This is what we are talking about. So it's not just about carbon footprints, okay? There's much more to the whole idea of, you know, carbon. So the point is that indigenous episteme, in making these assertions about indigenous knowledge systems, I'm not suggesting that the Western intellectual traditions are irrelevant or not useful in understanding our world. I'm acutely aware that no knowledge system offers complete understanding of our world, as Rigby seems to suggest in the quotation that I just, you know, referenced. Although I think in many ways Western intellectual traditions are heading for an impasse. In fact, Achille Mbembe thinks that they have reached their point of exhaustion and they need to look elsewhere. That may be an exaggeration, but he's making an important point. Again, I recognize that Western intellectual traditions are not homogeneous bodies of knowledge, and that they illuminate a very particular way of understanding, examining, and knowing the world, but they equally remain deeply territorial and imperial, as scholars such as Mignolo have pointed out. My interest in indigenous knowledge resides precisely in the fact that they do not simply offer new episteme, but as I said, a radical method. What Mignolo and Plastanova call or refer to as border thinking. The indigenous knowledges offer border thinking, that is, thinking beyond limits, beyond, for example, narrow and self-serving imperialist Western modes of knowledge production. And I'm aware that disruptive philosophical translation of knowledge requires us to move beyond the application of Western-centric normative epistemic lens that is fixated with universalism, often implying that is the only way of doing things. My point is that conceptualization of the past through such alternate epistemologies opens up possibilities to develop the ideas and methodologies needed for our times. Indeed, more than ever before, our modes of knowledge making must be attentive to the realities and challenges of our planetary life and the human footprints implicated in its ongoing damage. Indigeneity is a recourse to repressed knowledges and historical landscape, and the lessons of the land and place as knowledges that are not fossilized and essentialized in time and space. Quite often, when we talk about indigenous knowledge system, we insist or believe that that's fossilized knowledge. Why are you going back to them? You know? Don't they say that? Am I lying? That's fossilized knowledge, essentialized, you know. When knowledges are repressed, it does not mean that they're essentialized. It does not mean, you know, that they're fossilized. Land is taken here both concretely and metaphorically, which allowing bodies to implicate space and knowledge simultaneously. Land is more than a physical space. It is a spiritual place and a spiritually centered understanding of social space. It is about place, environments, water, sky, soils. Land offers spiritual connection between peoples, nature, and their cosmological beliefs and practices. This is a very important point. In South Africa, where I come from and where I live now for over 30 years, whenever indigenous people talk about land, they are dismissed. They are told land is just for agriculture. Yeah, that's what they tell them. Land is for agriculture. You are going to starve if we give you land. And you ask yourself, for all these years, how are indigenous people eating and feeding themselves? You know? The impression is always created that it's only the advent of colonialism that brought food. Well, I suppose they brought variety, sometimes very dangerous variety, you know? In my case, where you found that, you know, maize replaced sorghum, which is more nutritious than maize itself. And I suppose because it was white, everybody was obsessed, you know. This is better, you know. We're going for maize, you know. Sorghum is not good enough, you know. What is this about this African perspective? The late environmental activist Wangari Maathai, that most of you must know of, suggested that ecological crises we are facing today could be reduced if we reanimate pre-colonial practices which are anchored in belief systems that protect the environment and the animals. For Maathai, the boundary between the secular and the spiritual in African environmental conservation is fluid, just as spiritual and material realities on the continent are intertwined. Achille Mbembe has gone further, but without confining his argument to Africa by suggesting that, and I quote, humans are part of a very long, deep history that is not simply theirs, as they think. That history is vastly older than the very existence of the human race, which, in fact, is very recent. I don't know whether you know that you are very recent, you know. And they share this deep history with other forms of living entities and species. Our history is therefore one of entanglement with multiple other species. And this being the case, the dualistic partitions of minds from bodies, meaning and matter, or nature from culture, can no longer hold. You are just one of the very few, and but one with a very recent history here on Earth. Remember that. So Mbembe goes on to insert into this debate the concept of agency and power, arguing that these qualities have to be extended to non-human nature and our conventional understanding of life as fundamentally dualistic in ways that privileges the human, and that this must be called into question, if not altogether disrupted. He writes, and I quote, "To be a subject is no longer to act autonomously in front of an objective background, but to share agency with other subjects that have also lost their autonomy. We have to shift away from the dreams of mastery." Unquote. We have to shift away from the dreams of mastery. For Mbembe, the world is in need of a new understanding of ontology, epistemology, ethics, and politics that allow us to overcome an anthropocentric view of the world that has created the artificial splits between nature and culture. Now, this anti-Cartesian view of the planetary Earth is one that is also shared by African theologians, who posit that one of the primary functions of African religious mythology is to reconcile our waking consciousness with the mysteries of nature, as God is everywhere and the individuation of his spirit can also be found in rocks, in caves, in forests, in rivers, and animals. The individuation of God can be found in all these places. That's what the theologians tell us. I studied Greek drama and a bit of Greek mythology, and I was telling them one of the most fascinating things about Greek mythology is the entanglement that was there between the humans and the gods. In fact, I was watching a statue in which there were these women. This is in the famous Acropolis Museum, for those of you who have gone there. These women who were actually serving the gods food. That kind of entanglement in understanding our cosmos is very illuminating, because it collapses these hierarchies where God becomes so mysterious that it's unreachable. You know, the West Africans, through their writer Chinua Achebe, tells us that in his community, God was also created by people, and when people were tired of God, they just took it to the next boundary, you know, and abandoned him there and created another one. You know. It's a very fascinating concept of living, you know, and bonding with nature. So, Bengu, another theologian, makes a simpler point when he argues that our status as creatures is interconnected with the existence of other creatures. Our being is one minute and integral part of a unified cosmic process of being. So we are in that web, you know, of life, that web of interconnected. My argument is that African communities have tended to view the Cartesian logic that sets humans apart from animals and rationalizes the destruction of other members of the planetary habitat as a modern deformation of the world. From them, the need to care for human life correlated with the imperative of responsibility to non-human animals or non-living entities. And I know you are going to tell me, is that still true? Of course not. It's not true. And you know the answers why it is not true. And I'm not suggesting that, the African, societies were idealistic, and just pristine, there were no conflicts, no changes, no tensions. There were tensions, of course, but they knew they had ways of dealing with this. Whenever there were tensions, as I'm going to suggest later, you offered sacrifice to appease the land, to appease the river, to appease the mountain, to appease the sea, to thank the gods for the harvest, to arrive at that, stability. So Ubuntu, you must be asking, so when are you going to tell us about Ubuntu? Now, in this lecture, I wish to argue that the call for the centering of the human that African scholars signal here has always been an integral part of Africa's view of ecology and are embodied in a number of their belief systems and philosophical concepts such as Ubuntu, Ukama, and Mat, found across the continent. Indeed, Africa's communitarian ethos has always been associated with these concepts. Ubuntu, that refers to shared humanity and interrelatedness within the totality of the universe. Ukama, that places emphasis on the interconnectivity of humans and the environment, ancestors, and God. And Mat, which emphasizes harmony, righteousness, and the need to locate and understand oneself and one's actions in the context of the large whole. Thus, contrary to the anthropocentric ideas, there's a strong emphasis on the interrelatedness or interconnectedness of human beings and the rest of nature across the continent. I also wish to add that African writers, from foundational to more recent contemporary writers, have often drawn attention to human affinity with the more than human members of the planetary universe. He made reference to that during his talk on cultural ecology. If I had time, although I will mention one or two towards the end, I could give you, examples where these, foundational writers especially drew attention to the affinity between the Africans and their total environment. I wish to argue that Ubuntu philosophy that I'm familiar with and I have spent some time studying rests on the principle, as I said, of co-agency, which places emphasis on the dialogical relationship between humans and other species. Not just nature, but the totality of our planetary universe, which among many African societies will also include the relationship with ancestors and the supreme being or beings. So ancestor are always seen as the living dead, and you are constantly in touch with them. That is why Dr. Mabena that I was showing you there was in touch with his father's spirit, instructing to do what he has to do. The point is that when we talk about interrelatedness, we require a corresponding philosophical approach that looks at nature in totality, and Ubuntu would seem to offer that vision. Magoro Ramose, one of the leading scholars of Ubuntu, argues that Ubuntu in its essence is the capacity to perceive, and I quote, being or the universe as a complex wholeness involving the multi-layered and incessant interaction of all entities. End of quote. The non-human is not excluded from this wholeness, and that caring for one another is the fulfillment of the natural duty to care for the physical nature as well, especially because Ubuntu, as he says, is the constant strive to strike and maintain a balance between human beings and physical nature. So in a fundamental way, Ramos's position echoes back to pre-colonial metaphysics of nature, in which the emphasis was always on achieving a balance, striving for harmony and a productive coexistence between species. The traditional African metaphysical outlook implies recognition and acceptance of interdependence and peaceful coexistence between earth, plants, animals, humans, and land, including non-animate objects. Whenever this balance was upset, there was always a form of restitution, an attempt to reconcile the human back to the environment, either through ritual and sacrifice or penalty. Again, those of you read the Old Testament, this is all far too familiar. All far too familiar. The ultimate sacrifice you were given was indeed Jesus, the Son of God, sacrificing for your own atonement. You remember the sacrifice that Abraham was involved in? You remember? Of his son? Do you remember that? Huh? He was ready to sacrifice his son, and God intervenes and said, hey, hold on. And a ram appears from nowhere. In December, I was holding a feast for my in-laws from France, and a friend of mine told me I was going to buy meat. I was scared I'm an environmental scholar. How am I going to? Because traditionally, you would be required to slaughter something. And he told me something very interesting that I've never thought about. James, do you know that before you slaughter, in our culture, you go and talk to that animal? Explain to the animal why you are doing that. That, please listen, we are sacrificing you so that we can bring together these two communities together. Do you understand? Do you allow us to go ahead? That is what indigenous communities do. It was not this rampant killing that you hear of, I know these days you want to sanitize it and make it appear like you've used a gun, so it's better, But you've not given permission. You have not talked to the animals. You ravage the forest without talking to the forest. You do that. So that form of engagement becomes quite important. So there was always, as I said, whenever this balance was upset, there was always a form of restitution, an attempt to reconcile the humans back to environment, either through ritual or sacrifice or penalty. Humans have mistakenly, and over the years, replaced their responsibility over the earth as co-creators, and have instead sought to impose its authority over all species and objects on earth. It is this artificial hierarchy that traditional concepts such as Ubuntu allows us to disrupt. Benazet Bujo, a Central African theologian, asserts that, and I quote, "The African is convinced that all things in the cosmos are connected. All natural forces depend on each other so that human beings can live in harmony only in and with the whole of nature." Excuse me. Murobe, another scholar of Ubuntu, points out that African beliefs there inheres conviction that Ubuntu, that is person, was not only related to the other Ubuntu people, she also related to the natural environment. So personhood, as we know it, is therefore not just a moral attribute assigned to humans, and this is important, especially those of you who are interested in notions of moral considerability when it comes to other forms of living, that personhood is not just a moral attribute to humans, but one that extends also to the more than non-human or non-humans. You know, forgive my use of the two. You academics are always creating new words, and it's very difficult. And I think it's something that Kate talks about in her book, you know, anthropocentric, Pluto, what? You know, the whole range of them. In our book here, we talk about capitalism, you know, I'll show you, you know. So there are those proliferation of those. It is therefore not surprising that the concept of Ubuntu extends beyond, you know, interpersonal interactions into a range of relations between humans, nature, that are fundamental to Nguni cosmology. For example, in Southern Africa, you know, the Zulu, for example, believe that there's a special relationship between a person and his environment, and that plant and animal life somehow affect the environments. Besides, a Zulu conceives of good health not only as consisting of a healthy body, but as a healthy situation of everything that concerns him. That is the kind of sustainability that we are talking about. That's the kind of well-being that we are talking about, that the well-being is not just about you, but it's about the totality of your environment. I'm aware that these debates are not confined to Africa, and I'm by no means suggesting that Ubuntu ontology is exceptional. There has been over the years an increase in scholarly interventions which seek to disrupt the kind of dualism that I'm talking about. That is why Braidotti, remember that famous author of Posthuman, the Posthuman? That is why Braidotti includes Ubuntu alongside Eduardo Glissant's Poetics of Paul Gilroy's Planetary Cosmopolitanism, and Atur Bra Diasporic Ethics, and Homi Bhabha's Subaltern Secularism. What Braidotti is signaling here is that the idea that in its multifarious strands, Ubuntu speaks to shared experiences of various marginalized groups in ways that empowers humans as well as non-humans, thus marking a post-human ethic that sees the world as having a complexity beyond anthropocentric interest. In this respect, Braidotti argues again that, and I quote, post-human knowledge and the knowing subjects that sustain it enacts a fundamental aspiration to principles of community bonding while avoiding the twin pitfalls of conservative nostalgia or neoliberal euphoria as we know it, end of quote. In the West, the discourse is linked, of course, to deep eco-criticism, for example, which have championed what they call a holistic ontology of the environment, but one which has its own challenges. Post-colonial ecological critics have argued that North American environmentalism, in the form of deep eco-criticism, while claiming to be holistic and putting to rest human-nature dichotomy, has shown the tendency to separate the history of the empire from eco-critical thought, which dehistoricizes nature and often contributes to a discourse of green Orientalism. One time I mentioned this and I was taken on by those who were saying, but you know, green Orientalism has moved on, you know, has done wonderful things. Yeah, the argument is that this amounts to a misrepresentation of the past and a possible distortion of ecological futures bereft of a history that has always been complex, and I'm referring to the history of the empire. Goha, for example, has contended that deep ecology demonstrates, and I quote, a lack of concern with inequalities within human societies, end of quote, and in the process dehistoricizes nature and overlooks more pressing environmental issues such as global militarization, the growing, and I quote, overconsumption by industrial nations and by urban elites in the third world, end of quote. So what we are saying here, the Anthropocene has to be differentiated. It can't be the same. Levels of vulnerabilities are different. And levels of contribution to the Anthropocene is also different. This is the point I've always insisted on. Africa and Asia have not contributed to the Anthropocene in the same measure, let's face it. And yet, we are the most affected. Okay? We are the most affected. So when that poor old woman is crying, we can no longer read the winds. Who is to blame? Who takes responsibility for the cry of that woman? The native woman, auntie in Australia. We need to understand that. So Goha points out that the construction of pristine, read non-human, wilderness areas in Africa and elsewhere in the world, often encouraged by Western financial agencies, only benefits elite tourists rather than local peoples, and in the process positions, and I quote, enjoyment of nature as an integral part of the consumer society, end of quote, rather than challenging the capitalist logic of consumption that creates the need for conservation to begin with. He concludes, and I quote, despite its claims to universality, deep ecology is firmly rooted in American environmental and cultural history and is inappropriate when applied to the third world. He's calling for discriminate and local application of knowledge here. So although post-colonial and decolonizing nations have debated these particular issues for decades in ways that firmly place the human in nature, there remains a persistent concern that the discourse of nature remains a universalizing one. And thus eco-criticism is particularly vulnerable to naturalizing dominant forms of environmental discourse, particularly those that do not fundamentally engage with questions of difference, questions of power, and privilege. And although ecology as a concept always demands multiple acts of translation from nature to human and from human to human, post-colonial ecology must require, or rather must engage, the complexity of global environmental knowledges, traditions, and histories in ways that move far beyond discourses of modernization theory that I made a reference to. It is for these reasons that the so-called pre-colonial models of ecology that Ubuntu offers remains relevant because of their capacity to foreground continuity and ethics of place and belonging, but also in relation to other non-human species, but without the trappings of discourses of wilderness and conservation. I'm very, very critical of conservation culture and theory because it remains isolationist, aimed at the elite, and I'm part of the elite. I'm not standing outside it. I go to those places, and the people that live around the so-called conservation areas are always seen as poachers. People who have lived with these animals and vegetations and for years suddenly become criminals. They are criminalized in the process, and we think we are preserving nature, you know. But for who? So I'm suggesting that an Ubuntu model would, for example, encourage the type of natural habitat that allows for a porous boundary between the human and non-human animals, plants, rivers, and inanimate objects, But it would also address itself to the question about the economics of human ecology that has been a vital historical aspect of post-colonialism and which has been overlooked by dominant forms, say, for example, Anglo-American environmental thought. Right now, in my country, South Africa, we are going through a serious energy crisis. The debate is around just energy transition. The West is pressing, get rid of coal, energy, get rid. And they're saying, but we keep exporting the best of our coal to the West. What are they doing with it? So there's that kind of dichotomy. And don't get me wrong, as an activist, I'm all for green energy. And we have to move towards it. But it cannot happen in ways that are unjust and punish those that... What about those who are working in those coal mines and those coal power stations? What kind of time frame are we allowing for some of these things? These are debates that as environmental activists we need to engage. It's important that we engage this. And given the disparities, the inequalities that we have in certain parts of the third world, it's not that easy. You know, right now, the rich in South Africa, and that includes even an ordinary professor like me, I can afford to put a solar panels and buy an inverter and live as if it doesn't really matter. I happen to be living close to embassies. It was by default, not by design. And when there are power cuts, we don't experience power cuts. Can you imagine? You know, people, we don't experience, because you are going to upset the embassies. We are on the same grade with America and all these, you know, don't touch, you know. People are missing, including business people, for 6 hours or more, going without electricity. And others have it 24/7. These are some of the challenges that we are facing in some of this debate. So what Ubuntu allows us to speak is to speak for nature in a language that does not only privilege, that does not privilege dualist thought or naturalize the hierarchies between human and non-humans or class interests that are cloaked behind the grammar of nature conservation. In this respect, my position echoes that of Michel Serres that I referenced at the beginning of this lecture, when he writes in his book, The Natural Contract, that global climate change calls for new ways of thinking. He calls for a radical restoration. And he writes, and I quote, "Never forget the place from which you depart, but leave it behind and join the universal. Love the bond that unites your plot of earth with the earth, the bond that makes kin and stranger resemble each other." End of quote. So underpinning this is the ethic of care, which has been extensively theorized in Ubuntu philosophy as eco-empathy, but one that is also found in feminist philosophy, for example, in eco-theology, for example, and these should form an important component of post-colonial and eco-critical thought. Serres calls this principle of caring the second law. He calls it the second law, which goes beyond loving one another or loving one another's neighbor. Okay? Isn't that what you are told? Love one another, or love your neighbor as you love yourself. That's the law. But he says, we are silent. This law is silent about mountains and lakes, for it speaks to men about men as if there was no world. He says, he writes, and I quote, "Here then is the second law, which asks for us to love the world. This contractual obligation is divided into the old local law that attaches to us the ground where our ancestors lie, and a new global law that no legislature has yet written, which requires of us universal love of the physical earth. Now, when Ceres talks of universal love to the earth, he's not talking about some abstract idea, but he gets towards the kind of love that is defined by double groundedness. Love that is rooted in local law of the ancestors, while simultaneously gesturing towards a universal planetary affinity of care, eco-empathy. What Ceres writes about is also at the heart of Ubuntu, which entails what Eduardo Glissant calls the poetic of relations, a way of responding to the fragmentation of history, and by conceiving of the totality, but willingly renouncing any claims to sum up or to possess it. The poetics of relation has a particular importance for an African ecology or post-colonial ecology that Ubuntu signals. An ecology that offers a critique of homogenizing models that tend to collapse far too easily global and local environmental issues, a model that calls for inclusiveness in difference, a model in which agency is decentered to allow for other non-human agents to acquire their rightful place in the planetary universe, and not as supplementary objects, but as subjects in their own right. Ubuntu also points to relations of interdependence of all lands and of the whole earth, thus offering the possibilities of imagining relations in new ways in order to forge new epistemologies. One of the ways through which Ubuntu philosophy enables this is in the manner in which it offers post-colonial environmental imagination, an awareness of our fragility when we act alone as fragmented lands or as fragmented people or humans divorced from nature itself. It collapses the humanist distinction between the so-called natural history and human history. Okay? In ending, as I move towards my ending, being a teacher, and I can tell that's the danger of being the last speaker. Yeah, I look at the body language of people, and I used to do that when I was lecturing. A number of African writers have often drawn our attention to some of these. J.C. Jordan, a South African writer, in The Wrath of the Ancestors, and I just want to give you a taste of what J.C. Jordan says here. Now, J.C. Jordan writes about a community called Mapondomisi from the Pondoland. And the Mapondomisi, in this community, one of their princes is called back from the university to come and take over the leadership. And in the process, the prince, because he's modern, marries a white woman. Very sweet queen. But among the Mapondomisi, they have, in the ecological system, the symbolic structure and its associated mythology is embodied in the snake called Majola. This snake is supposed to be the protector of children. So the queen gives birth to a child, and the Majola comes to visit the child. The Majola ordinarily is seen as a protector of the child. You do not just kill it when it comes. It doesn't harm anybody. But the queen, I suppose the first instinct, this is not part of her culture, does what? Kills the snake. she comes from European or a Judeo-Christian thought where the snake is always seen as what? The snake is venomous, it's a traitor, okay? You remember, you know, the snake is the one that's supposed to have deceived, you know? The poor Eve is always the woman that is put, you know? It's always the woman, you know? She's the one, yes. Where are you? You know? You remember when God is looking for Adam, where are you? You know, I was reminding the group in Greece that even in the Bible, the founding fathers of that community were embedded in nature. The Garden of Eden. And so when God calls Adam, where are you? Adam is irrelevant. I'm naked. You know, it's not answering the question. You know, why? This woman. You know? And then they say, it's the snake that misled, you know, the snake. So the point I'm making here is that in Jordan's book, The Wrath of the Ancestors, the affinity between humans and animals is surfaced in a very subtle way. In Chinua Achebe's Hour of God, those who have read, again, another of a serious Christian boy called Oduche, you know, the son of the main character there called Ezeulu. He was sent to the mission house to study the ways of the white man, but he went beyond that. He comes back and he wants to kill the royal python, which is a taboo. You cannot kill the royal python because it's part and parcel of the community. Again, I'm basically using that to demonstrate to you the affinity between these communities and the animals. And finally, in this book, it's one of the most fascinating texts. I would want you to read it in the company of men. The text offers one of the most recent and authoritative picture of man's role in the degradation of the environment and how man's interventions in the cycle of life leads to abominable and uncontrollable diseases such as Ebola. The stories of man's hands in the destruction of the environment is told through non-humans, like bats, like the baobab tree. Even the virus has a voice. Among others, that Tajo endows with agency and voice. He gives this some form of agency and voice. Watching over the earth is the ancient and wise baobab tree, mourning the dire state of the earth, yet providing a sense of hope for the future. This, in my view, is a forceful fable which captures the fragility of life. When the human turns on its own environment, then he must know that the consequences are bound to be dire and unremitting, like the Ebola that now threatens to wipe the whole community. I'm giving you this basically to show you a spread of cultural expressions, the type that we were hearing about, that constantly are beginning to speak, have always done, and continue to speak about the relations between the humans and non-human. And now finally, and then I release you to go for your meals. Finally, in trying to examine the belief in a fundamental interrelatedness between natural objects, scholars like Kevin Bryan have sought to argue that this requires a certain measure of what he calls moral considerability, because, as he says, entities are part of an interconnected web of life. In other words, when we evoke the principle of co-agency, which implies an interconnected web of life involving different entities, are we not suggesting that these entities outside the human are also agents and by extension morally considerable? That's a question I'm posing to you. So writing about African thought, Behrens makes a distinction between moral value, things of moral value, and entities that are morally considerable. He writes, "My main claim," and I'm quoting, "is that African thought extends moral considerability to include all things that are part of the interconnected web of life. That is, all individual living things, groups of living things such as families, species, ecosystems, as well as inanimate natural objects such as rivers and mountains. Granting moral considerability to other natural entities entails a rejection of a strong anthropocentric view, inasmuch as the interests of human nature are also considered to be of moral significance." According to the web of life criterion, moral considerability could be extended even to geological formations on the basis of their history and the natural process of their coming into existence. They are morally considerable because they have been forged through the process that continue to create and sustain life. It is on this basis that Behrens argues that it is plausible to include inanimate natural entities within the scope of what is morally considerable. Similarly, since the belief in ancestors implies a continuity and interdependence between generations, they too would qualify as morally considerable. Since, as Weredu, that is the West African philosopher, argues, the intergenerational moral accountability is intrinsic to African thought. He says, "Of all the duties owed to the ancestors, none is more imperious than that of husbanding the resources of the land so as to leave it in good shape for posterity. In this moral scheme, the rights of the unborn play such a cardinal role that any traditional African would be nonplussed by the debate in Western philosophy as to the existence of such rights. In upshot, there's a two-sided concept of stewardship in the management of the environment, involving obligations to both ancestors and descendants, which motivates environmental carefulness, all things being equal." In conclusion, I wish to state that since Ubuntu is relational and necessarily takes into account relationships and connectedness of everything in nature, its principle of co-agency, premised here on what Behrens calls moral considerability, works to promote harmony, solidarity, respect, and mutual cooperation between natural things. If indeed what is central to morality is life, as in the web or fabric of life, then anything that forms part of this complex web of life can be morally considerable.